Hello. Today we're going to be talking about maladaptation. We're going to be talking about how some past societies failed to develop a sustainable relationship with their environment and experienced catastrophes of various natures. We'll just focus on two examples, but there are a lot of examples out there, and if you're interested in this topic, I can suggest additional literature, additional examples that you can investigate. So first thing I want to talk about is put this in terms of how cornucopians or neo-Malthusians might look at these past examples. I would imagine that most cornucopians would be very dismissive of these past examples. They would talk about how these are old examples, that these societies, some of them were not even literate. They all were pre-Enlightenment societies existing before the scientific revolution. Many would point out that they had primitive economies. They had not developed a free market foundation that could unleash innovation, and that made them unable to adapt to information and as it was becoming available. So that's one way to look at what we're going to talk about. Neo-Malthusians, on the other hand, would argue that aspects of human nature and culture still leave us vulnerable today. And that's why we're going to go through this exercise. I want you to make up your own mind, and we'll be talking about this in class. Before we get into this, many of you have had anthropology classes, and what's going to strike you is that Jared Diamond and what we're going to be talking about today is assailed a lot in especially cultural anthropology. And I want to give you some reasons as to why I think that is the case, and exactly how his arguments and others are assailed. First of all, the idea of the rational actor, that human groups tend to act rationally, is an idea that came out of economics, but it managed to seep into all other areas of academia, including areas that study human behavior like sociology, political science, anthropology. It's the notion that you might have somebody like a crazy uncle who's definitely not rational, but when you aggregate people, people are rational, so you can expect cultures to act rational. So if people fail to adapt to their environment, there must be something else that was going on. In the case of Easter Island, a lot of cultural anthropologists deny the scenario laid out by Jared Diamond and say that everything was fine there until the Europeans arrived and they were the ones that destroyed the environment. There's a lot of evidence, though, to contradict that. Another thing about anthropology and cultural anthropology, it kind of grew up in the time of a backlash against what was called environmental determinism. Environmental determinism was a school of thought that was especially strong in geography at the turn of the 20th century. It has a lot in common with social Darwinism. It's the idea that you can explain attributes of people based on the environment they come from. So there were ridiculous studies done, for example, that tried to argue that the North, for example, was more industrious than the South because of the environment, that in the South, summers were long and hot and sticky, so people wouldn't want to read books, which is why people read more books in the North. And there were a lot of studies, some of them that's benign compared to some of the other studies that basically built a case that people from colder climates had to do more to survive, or harder working, more industrious. So when environmental determinism was finally crushed, it almost knocked geography out as a school of academic inquiry. It disappeared from a lot of colleges and universities. The backlash was, it was a deserved backlash, because this was really not a very good way of looking at the world, and it had a lot of racism embedded in it, and kind of was way to try to argue why certain groups were superior to others. But cultural anthropology in particular has been very vigilant for almost a century now, attacking anything that it thinks reeks of environmental determinism. Cultural anthropologists believe that humans are born a blank slate and that life, especially culture, helps determine and your immediate events in your family draws on that slate and makes you who you are. So of course, family is very important, but also the culture you grow up in plays a huge role in making you who you are. So when anthropologists encounter ideas like from E.O. Wilson and Jared Diamond, um, they find them very offensive and the attacks can be fierce and ugly. E.O. Wilson, I advise you to look him up, one of the most brilliant biologists of the 20th century. He's still active. Um, among his many contributions was he invented social biology, which is given an offshoot of that is evolutionary psychology. But basically, E.O. Wilson in evolutionary biology, which was a book written in the early 70s, argued that all animals, including humans, are hardwired in certain ways. So for our discussion today, one of the things that Wilson argued was that we're hardwired to seek status. And Wilson contradicted the idea of humans being born a blank slate. And the idea that what we inherited, this kind of reptilian brain, could play a role in human events was thoroughly rejected by cultural anthropologists. And E.O. Wilson, and I've met him, he's a really nice, kind man, was even labeled by some people as a Nazi and a fascist back in the 70s. Jared Diamond has experienced perhaps not the same level of attack, but there's a cottage industry at least 20 years ago that was trying to pick apart all of his arguments centered around cultural anthropology. One of these was a book produced by Hunt and Lippo called The Statues Walked that really goes against a century of archaeological data, said that rather than dragging these statues, they were stood up and walked. And people who've examined this argument, from engineers to other archaeologists, have pretty much rejected it. But in some ways, it seems like their work was biased from the get-go to try to disprove Diamond's argument. A more recent book about Easter Island by anthropologists goes back to more of the original picture. Bond and Flenny's Easter Island, Earth Island is a good book to look at as a rebuttal. Finally, I want to say one more thing about anthropologists is that often their views can be colored by certain values. So as a graduate student, I went off to the Colombian Amazon where I lived for 2 years to do research, and I'll tell you that story sometime if you're interested in it. But it happened rather suddenly, and I didn't have a great amount of time to prepare myself for the exact location I was going to be in. And I had taken a number of anthropology classes before I went, in part because I've always been fascinated by how do you explain the relationship that humans have with their environment. And one of the thoughts I came across frequently was that cannibalism was an invention of European colonists, and they invented the whole notion of cannibalism as a way of dehumanizing new people they came in contact with so that they could exploit them and do inhuman things with them. My experience in the Amazon was that cannibalism had been very real not too long ago, and I wasn't hearing that from the mouths of European explorers. I was hearing it from the mouths of indigenous people who not only described incidents of cannibalism, but the group I lived with, a group called the Witotos, they even had a sacred song that they would sing before they would eat somebody. So keeping that in mind, there is certainly a lot of bias you can sometimes find within anthropology. Right. Now I'd like to turn our focus to Polynesians. Polynesian arrival on Easter Island there's different types of evidence. Most people agree it happened around 400 AD. This is based on estimates mostly by linguists. The archaeological evidence is a few hundred years younger, so 600 to 7 AD, but also population evidence seems to suggest something closer to 400, so based on population growth. Um, when people arrived on Easter Island, so they were Polynesians, they were part of one of the greatest diasporas in history. They colonized a lot of the Indo-Pacific region, and they came as far away as Easter Island and Hawaii. Those were the furthest outposts of colonization. So arriving on Easter Island was no accident. It was a deliberate act of colonization. They came in several ships. We know that they brought a simple food production toolkit with them that included the knowledge how to make ships, and ships are important for fishing, an important part of the, especially in this case, the fishing strategies that required them to go into the deeper water. They brought root crops with them. They brought Polynesian rats, a special species of rat, and chickens. When they arrived with them, they brought a particular form of government that, you know, with a lot of variation, I'm sure was common when people lived in smaller groups. It's called a primitive chiefdom. This form of government cannot govern larger numbers of people because it puts an enormous amount of power in a single person's hand. I spent 2 years in the Amazon, and I lived with groups that could be classified as a primitive chiefdom. The name in Spanish for the chief of a group was cacique, and the cacique in at least the northwestern Amazon was the sole leader of a group. In addition to making political decisions, this individual was always a male, was also the head of the church, was in charge of all spiritual rituals, and was also the #1 medicine man usually. So think about it, church, state, and healthcare all wrapped up in one individual. So what happens as the population grew, divisions occurred, and the island's political structure fractured into one of rival clans. And the politics of these rival clans could be classified as anarchical. And the definition we're using here of anarchy is simply that there's a lack of somebody who sits on the top of this structure, somebody that could perhaps pull the brakes if things are not going right. Today's global order is often called anarchical because the UN has no power to make a large country like the United States or China or India or European Union do what it does not want to do. Doesn't mean that countries are always fighting with each other. It simply implies there's a lack of a higher order. A little bit about the environment on the island. The water around the island is a little cooler. It's not tropical, it's subtropical. I bring this up simply because of the water temperature, there wasn't a well-developed, or there's no coral reef really around the island. You find fish associated with coral reefs living in the rocks and around the rocks, but if you had the architecture of a coral reef, that would have really boosted the food supply of the island, but that was lacking. Easter Island's also an oceanic island, and that creates problems when it comes to vegetation colonization. And this is an island that's very far away from the mainland. The closest mainland is South America. So seeds have to travel long distances over salt water, and salt water kill most seeds. So usually the only way to get there is like on the feet or feather of birds. Somehow, and nobody knows, a seed of probably a Chilean wine palm made its way to the island because the one large tree that grew on Easter Island when the Polynesians arrived there appears to be very closely related to what's called the Chilean wine palm. Um, so somehow this seed managed to get there, a seed somehow, whether it's probably not on a bird, somehow it must have survived the saltwater journey and managed to start to grow and produced offspring. So what the Polynesians find when they arrive on Easter Island is a forest that consists of these palm trees plus smaller trees that are not big enough to make seaworthy vessels. So mostly subcanopy trees, kind of think about dogwoods, for example, or redbuds. Smaller trees that could be good for a certain material, like making rope, but not good for providing the foundation to make seaworthy vessels. Here's a photo of a modern day Chilean wine palm. So you can see it's quite sizable. Uh, so this is the only tree, not only large enough to make seaworthy vessels, but the sap, it's called the wine palm because people will tap it and make fermented beverage out of it. Seeds of palms can also be edible. Some are tasty, but many of them at least are very nutritious. When the people arrived here on Easter Island, the food supply was initially abundant. They were able to plant their root crops by cutting down chunks of the forest, burning it, and releasing the nutrients that were held in the vegetation into the ash and then back into the food they were growing. They had their chickens and rats. They had their boats, so their boats enabled them to go to neighboring small islands around Easter Island where seabirds nested, and they were able to go and collect bird eggs. Um, they did harvest some things from the nearshore environment, but their biggest source of seafood came from using their boats to hunt porpoises in open water. So the boats were really an important part of their food procurement structure. And an abundant food supply allowed for population growth. The island's population topped out at around 20,000 before crashing back to 2,000. So this is indeed a catastrophic decline in population that caused, one could imagine, enormous suffering and violence. All right, before we go any further now, we have to introduce the moai. The moai are these statues that Easter Island is famous for. On average, they were 13 feet high and weighed 13 tons. But before the collapse, they were getting larger and larger. There seemed to be this momentum to make them bigger and bigger with each generation. Some of the last moai had to be abandoned, never quite made it to their final destination, and these weighed close to 40 tons. And this doesn't even include the headpieces, which often weighed several tons in addition. You can see what they look like. You can see one with a headpiece on it. So how did these statues get from the one rock quarry on the island to where they were put up? So the prevailing theory is that when you only have human muscle as energy, you try to move enormous weight across the ground, you have to find some way to reduce the friction. So the most agreed upon theory is that these things were moved by putting rollers underneath them, by chopping up wood and putting up wood underneath so that you could move these statues over wood. So this was an incredible labor-intensive endeavor, and what did these moai signify? The sad reality is we don't know for sure. This phase of Easter Island culture was destroyed in the collapse. We have some oral tradition that survived to when the Europeans arrived, but it was most likely some form of ancestor worship or paying tribute to deities. But unfortunately, we can only guess. But it obviously had enormous significance for so much of energy of the people on this island to be dedicated, not only energy, but ultimately resources, since it seems that this more than anything drove deforestation, especially deforestation of wine palms on the island. Now, catastrophe comes from a series of terrible positive feedbacks. Um, Deforestation weakens the quality of the soil through erosion and the inability to produce a good burn to grow crops in. Hence, agricultural production declines. The wine palm goes extinct, and this deprives people not only of food, but their only way to make a seaworthy vessel, which harms them in two ways: harms their food supply. They can't collect eggs or hunt porpoises or other fish in the deep water. And ultimately, it deprives them of their avenue of escape, means that they can't try to look for some other place to live. They're stuck there. Uh, we know that cannibalism is used to acquire protein, and this helps to push down the population. We know that an insult, the worst way you could insult somebody there into the 20th century was to say, the flesh of your mother is stuck between my teeth. That clearly is an early reference to earlier cannibalism. And the net result, as I mentioned already, was that the population declined from 20,000 to 2,000. Now, Jared Diamond says they destroyed their environment not because they were especially evil or deprived of foresight, but because they were ordinary people living in a fragile environment, subject to the usual human problems of clashes between group interests, clashes between individual and group interests, selfishness, and limited ability to predict the future. So, how do we explain this tragedy? One is clearly competition. These statues at the, even though we're not sure what they meant, the fact that they were getting bigger implied a level of competition. And we can infer from that that status and the rewards of status were at play to some degree. Um, as I mentioned, E.O. Wilson in sociobiology and in subsequent works has talked about how we're hardwired, and most people today would agree that human beings are hardwired to seek status. Status can translate into power, influence, even access to potential mates. Other aspects, the anarchical structure made it hard for one individual or group to pull the brakes, even though some people might have been frightened by what was happening. There was no centralized power anywhere to stop um, the activities that were ha- under that were going on. Nobody to say no more cutting down of wine palms. Going to put a halt to moving statues. Things continued the way they were, and no one had the ability to pull the brakes. Topic that's interesting for today is introduced species. The Polynesian rat, we know from archaeologists, made it difficult for the wine palm to self-propagate. Most seeds that have been found were gnawed into by rats. So the ability of the wine palm to propagate without the help of humans was pretty much undermined by the rat. A few things about human nature is, one, we're not evolved to deal with slow threats that do not trigger our fight or flight instincts. Our fight or flight instincts are how we evolved to deal with a threat. And threats for most of human history were immediate in nature. They were large predators that threatened us. One of the worst predators, according to work that's been done in caves in Eurasia, were giant hyenas that killed quite a lot of people. Um, when you encounter a life-threatening predator, you respond with a fight or flight instinct, and what drives that is the release of a hormone called cortisol. Um, when something is slow moving, it's hard to perceive with your senses. Our evolutionary way of reacting to threats gets undermined. There's nothing to push us into action. Slow moving nature of threats, like in this case, we're talking about deforestation that happened gradually over hundreds of years, means that people have to put a lot of faith in oral storytellers, and oral storytellers are amazing. I heard people tell stories when I lived in the Amazon. It sounded like they were eyewitnesses to something that happened in the last few years. For example, when I arrived, started living with the Witotos, they kept talking about the war with Peru and being liberated from Peruvian slavery. And I felt bad that I didn't know anything about this. I pride myself on following current events. So one of the first things I did when I got out for a break the first time I was in Bogota, is I got on the internet and Googled this, and it happened in the early 1930s, but people described it like they were eyewitnesses. That's the power of oral storytelling. But you still have to put a lot of faith in something you haven't seen with your own eyes. Um, I think a lot of our problems today are similar, that people go more with their gut than with scientific knowledge. The Moai, it was probably hard to stop them, assuming they involved something along the religious dimension. It was hard to let go, and the idea maybe was that some sort of if you kept doing what you were doing, ultimately some deity, the ancestors, would intervene on your behalf to save you. So most importantly, you had to keep doing what you're doing and appeal to the good nature of higher powers to save you, rather than think about what you can do to save yourself. Uh, this is a topic I want you to think a lot about, but elites, each of these clans had leaders. Their legitimacy came from doing the things that they always did, and most important was providing food and putting up these statues. Elites are going to be resistant to change. If you start talking about changing society, that in some ways threatens their legitimacy. One of the things I want to also highlight is that cultures tend to have a strong conservative bias and resistance to change. Um, Elites tend to be the guardians of that status quo, and often this is not a bad thing. If there's the saying, if it's not broke, don't try to fix it. Uh, there are potential large costs to changing a model that's working, even if it's not working well for everybody. Um, Generally, change happens at such a slow pace that cultures benefit from having this bias against change. But when change has to happen quickly, this can become a big problem. You have to ask ourselves too if there was a quick tipping point after which things unraveled too quickly for them to adapt. Sometimes things can be declining at a gradual rate, and then things can really nosedive very fast. Final thing I'd like to bring up is the tendency of humans to discount the future. Um, Humans, different cultures look at the future in different ways. So, for example, even though Americans still make a lot more than average American makes a lot more than the average Chinese. The average Chinese family saves a lot more of their income each year than the average American family. Um, People look at the future in different ways and put value on that. Some people are committed to saving a lot of money for retirement. Some people don't think about it until they're almost at the door of retirement. Um, how we look at the future and how much value we put in the present versus the future is really important when you think about dealing with slow-moving environmental problems. All right, I'd like to go over one more example, and that is the Norse in Greenland. So the Norse are the Vikings. Again, another incredible diaspora. Um, Norse and then Norman make it all over Europe. And then in the Atlantic, they make it to Iceland, Greenland, and there's very good evidence they also made it to Canada and at least had temporary settlements there. On Greenland, they arrived around 982. They colonized the fjords, but basically they had two large settlements, the eastern and western. The so-called eastern settlements really not so much on the eastern side of the island, but at the tip of the island, the tip of Greenland. They appear around this time, the Norse were changing from paganism to Christianity. And while it's not conclusive, it appears that from the time they arrived, they were Christian. They were part of a feudal culture where there was strong class divisions. The top of the pecking order were the people who were the top of the church on the one side, and then on the secular side, you had people who inherited power from their parents. Um, most people were serfs, which meant they didn't own land, but they worked the land for others and got to keep a percentage of their own production. Greenland in particular has a pretty harsh climate because it has a small summer, so you crops weren't grown there. Instead, they practiced pastoralism. They harvested grass and timber, and the grass was used, and they would harvest a lot of grass to get through the long winters, and they kept cattle, sheep, and goats. They also had dogs and cats. Probably things got bad. I'm sure they ate their dogs. Not sure about their cats. And Europeans did eat dogs until not too long ago. In Switzerland, I think there's still a canton where they eat dogs. Um, now, they also were trading and hunting in nature. For example, they hunted walruses, and the walrus ivory became their primary export item. They would send that to elites in Europe who valued walrus ivory, and in turn, they would import luxury goods, items for churches, and things made of metal, which were important. They could smelt metal because there were enough trees to make charcoal out of, but we'll see charcoal started to become harder to produce as the forest became depleted. In this cold climate, again, trees, when you cut them, it takes decades for them to grow back. All right, when the Norse arrived in Greenland, they were alone. But over 100 years later, and again, this is hard to date, they were no longer alone. Group called the Inuits entered, or to be more specific, they're called the Thule. They arrived around 1100 AD, so roughly 100 years after the Norse arrived. They were replacing group that had lived so Greenland had been inhabited before the Norse. It's hypothesized that Dorset people had probably lived there, but had disappeared. During this time, too, the Thules were displacing the Dorset people. The Thule appeared to be very violent and aggressive, and the Dorset people were known as being not very violent. So Thule arrive on Greenland, and they practice hunting and gathering. We don't have anything from their own account. The only thing we know about them and their relationship with the Norse was written by the Norse. So the Norse did leave written records behind, and we know that their relationship was marked by violent conflicts. The Norse demonized the Thule because of religious differences, differences in societal organization, hunter-gatherers versus agrarian feudalists. Even in my time in the Amazon, I lived with agriculturalists, and they demonized hunter-gatherers as being one step above animals. So it's something that people have done throughout history. And also then the fact that the Thule may have started off the violence would have made fear a factor, and fear often leads to the dehumanization of other people. So then the Norse, at their peak in the two settlements, reached around 6,000 people. That seems very small today, but in the Middle Ages, that's nothing to scoff at. That was a pretty respectable population size. It was large enough for the Catholic Church to send them a bishop for a while. And while the conflict with the Thule was somewhat troubling because the Norse would have to leave their settlements for hunting, they did have the upper hand since they were fighting with weapons and armor made of metal, and they were going against people who made weapons from wood, rocks, and bone. Now, they, though, also experience a catastrophe. Um, First of all, trade with Europe dries up, partly due to a cooler climate, making travel more difficult, but mostly due to the collapse in demand for walrus ivory. Elites in Europe had become more enamored in elephant ivory, so all of a sudden nobody wanted walrus ivory. And there's a warning here that it can be difficult to can be dangerous to specialize too narrowly in a trading economy on one particular item or a small subset. Their forests were also becoming depleted, and wood became scarce so that there is no more way to make charcoal, made it harder for them to cook, to stay warm, even to fix weapons, to resmelt swords down, for example. Um, Charcoal became a luxury, and that starts to change the game, not to mention that people are staying cold in the winter. And winters are getting worse. So when the Norse arrived there, this is what's known as the medieval warm period, which ran roughly 300 years. But by around 1250, things are changing. And the Little Ice Age is marked from 1303 to 1806. During this period, things become a lot different. Now, we don't exactly know what happened. We do know the Norse didn't adapt very well. Um, they go extinct on Greenland. Uh, Genetic testing of modern day people living on Greenland show no Norse DNA. They're 100% Inuit, which means that surviving Norse people didn't intermarry with the Inuits. Um, they seem to have completely gone extinct. And this is interesting because they had options. They could have abandoned agriculture and become hunter gatherers, but even though they knew this was an option, they decided not to take this option. So I would like to look at some of the factors that could explain this tragedy. One is that climate change undermined the food supply of Nordic settlements. Um, Shorter growing seasons could not produce enough grass to maintain necessary herd sizes. Given the feudal structure, one would imagine that the serfs suffered first. Maybe the serfs demanded or were pushing for change, but they didn't have the power. This is a type of society where there's incredible inequality. Um, Serfs probably, without the organizational capacity, without some amazing organization, could not oppose the religious and secular elites. Uh, Society also didn't change fast enough for some reason to adapt to this changing environment. And one can, to some extent, excuse them just because the weather gets colder for a few years. You don't know that you're going to continue till 1806. So religion could have played a role also in slowing adaptation by A, believing God would eventually intervene in their behalf, by demonizing the way the pagans lived as being ungodly. There could have been many reasons why change wasn't allowed. And we do know from some surviving texts that fraternization with the Inuits was strictly forbidden, and there was serfs would be punished severely for even with death for fraternizing with the enemy. So hope and optimism is also something, a very human feature, and when you reinforce that with religion, might have undermined any thoughts of adaptation. Again, there's the idea that we just need to double down we haven't been good Christians. We just need to double down and God will save us, rather than people trying to save themselves. Important thing is that if they had become hunters and gatherers, they would have had to not only change their lifestyle, but elites would give up their source of power, which is control over the land and its resources. And this would be one reason why elites, as I mentioned, elites are often a drag on change, because they often have the most to lose from change. And in this case, they would lose a lot. And finally, again, a warning for today is that narrow economic niches can leave a society very vulnerable. Okay, before I end, I just want to say that there are many other examples of maladaptation out there. Some of the most sensational include the Khmer of Cambodia, the Mayans of Central America, the Anastasians of Southwest, what is now US, Colorado, New Mexico area, the Sumerians. I do a long lecture on the Sumerians, but they're one of the most important first civilizations. They gave us writing, accounting, arithmetic, pottery, but their tale of destroying their environment too, as over time their soil became salinated and unable to grow the amount of crops needed to support their urban populations. I'd like you to take a look at these discussion questions. We will be going over these during the next class. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to discussing this in class.